Okay, so we've talked about the course structure, and we've talked about how Visual Studio and XNA and how you're going to use that to develop code in the course. So it's time for us to talk about that first C# program that you're going to build. Before we do, we're now into the second module of the class. I've broken the course into modules so I can collect together topics that are similar to each other and sort of go together. And for each module, I have a set of learning objectives that I expect you to meet to succeed in that module. This particular module only has one learning objective, and that learning objective is about developing a simple console application. So for each of the lectures from now on, the second slide in will be a reminder of what the lesson objectives are for that module. Now, you'll notice on the very far left, there's a column called Bloom Level, and this particular one is Bloom Level 3 for Apply. So let's talk about Bloom for a moment. So Bloom's taxonomy is all about different levels of learning, and the lowest level is remembering. So that's called level 1, and it's just about, can you memorize facts and sort of parrot those back when the time comes, all the way to the highest level, which is creating. And so there's a pyramid of different sort of levels of understanding, if you will, or learning, in terms of how you can take what you know and either synthesize it or just explain it to somebody else or actually apply it in practice and so on. So those are the different things that we consider when we talk about Bloom's taxonomy. So each time I have an objective, I try to figure out where that falls in Bloom's taxonomy. And in this course, you're going to see that almost everything falls under understanding or applying. So most of our stuff will be, you either need to understand something, so you could explain it to somebody else, for example, or you need to be able to apply it. And there's tons of application in this course. You need to be able to do a lot of stuff. And that's application. That's applying on the Bloom's taxonomy. So we're going to do a couple of in-lecture quizzes right off the bat to warm you up. We talked last time about what process we go through to actually develop software. So you should go do the in-lecture quiz about software and what that's all about. We also talked about the fact that you program in a particular language. In this class it's C#, but in other courses or just on your own, it could be one of many, many different programming languages. So now you get to do another in-lecture quiz talking about programming languages and what your preferences are. Okay, so I've done this before, but we're going to start up Visual C# 2010 Express to actually do a C# program. As before, I'm going to start us off with a console application, and we'll move towards XNA games once we get to really next week. Next week is when we'll start really hitting XNA games. So as you recall, new project. I'm going to pick the Visual C# here on the left. Third one down is the console application. And I'm going to name this first C# program. And click OK. Last time I showed you a quick and dirty typing in one line of code. This time I'm going to do it a little more thoroughly. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add comments. Now, comments, different people have different opinions about comments, so there's a totally separate lecture about comments. So I'm just going to do it now, and I'll talk about it in the next lecture. So I'm going to add a comment above the class that says a class that prints a message. I'm going to add a comment above what's called the method. This main thing is called the main method. Main method to print message. And I'm even going to put in here command line args. So the chapter in the book talks about all this structure and how it works. Basically, this right here that I'm highlighting, let me zoom in so you can see that better. This right here that I'm highlighting is actually information that can get passed in if in fact you do use a command prompt when you run the program. The template automatically puts it there, so it's going to be just fine if you leave it alone. I'm going to say print a message, yet another comment, though it's a slightly different kind. These are documentation comments because they can actually be used to generate documentation for other people using the software. These are called line comments because they're just inlines within the program. So I'm going to print a message like I did before. Although I will be nicer this time. Last time, you know, I called you noobs and that was really mean. So I should really say hi smart noob because that's much nicer. And I'm going to add one more output here, but I'm actually going to not have it print anything. It's just going to output an empty line, which will look a little nicer. I'll show you when we get there. So now, now I'm going to press F6, which, as we know, does something important, and you should go do the in-lecture quiz to tell me what that thing is. Okay, now I press F6. I get build succeeded, which is great. So I've done that second step, right? I've built the software, so now it's in a form that the computer can understand. And next, I'm going to actually run it. So I'll do Control F5 to run it, because this is a console application. Before I do, you should go do an in-lecture quiz. Okay, Control F5, and this time, of course, the much nicer message, right? Hi, smart noob. But you'll notice that console.writeLine put a blank line here, which is kind of nice because it separates this standard prompt to continue from the actual message or the output from the program. And so I'm also going to save this time. So I'm going to say File, Save All, and now I'm going to save it somewhere. And I will browse to the place where I want to save it. People always laugh at me about my folder structure because it's very complicated, but that's because I have an awful lot of stuff on my computer. So we'll go to lesson 3, which is right here, and that's where I'll save this particular program. Remember last time I didn't save it, I discarded it, and when you work and have done some productive stuff, you definitely want to save it. So that's what I just did. So let's close down the environment. And one last thing that I want to comment on before we close out this lecture. It's important to understand that so far I have solved really simple problems. I've solved the problem of printing an interesting message to the screen. In general, we're going to solve far more complicated problems as we develop games. And it's important that you understand that the problem-solving process is very iterative. We're going to do a little bit. We're going to try it out and make sure it works. We're going to go back and do a little bit more. We're going to try and make sure it works. We're also going to debug when we discover it doesn't work. So you shouldn't feel disheartened if in fact you find yourself going back and fixing things or adding pieces one at a time, because this development process is hugely iterative. If you're writing 2 million lines of code, which we won't do in this class, but if you're writing 2 million lines of code, you're never going to just pound on the keys for a few months, typing all the source code in, and then hope it all works. That's not how programming works at all. We do tiny pieces and check them, because when they break, not if, when, we have a tiny little bit of new code to look at. So just remember, programming is this really iterative process. Okay, so that's it for today. Next time, we're going to actually talk about commenting and why it's useful and important.